They said the poor cowboy only took her to settle a debt. But the first night at his ranch, Rose saw something that made her question everything she'd been told. Snow hammered the cabin roof hard enough to shake the lantern above the table. Rose stood frozen in the doorway, her fingers tight around the wool blanket, watching Wyatt Turner outside in the storm. He was sitting alone beside the barn in knee-deep snow, one hand gripping a rope tied to the roof beam so the house wouldn't collapse while she slept inside warm. And when he looked up at her through the blowing white darkness, he quickly looked away first. If stories like this still find a place in your heart, stay a while and share where you're watching from tonight. Snow had been falling over Elk Ridge since late afternoon, thick white sheets drifting across the valley until the fences looked buried to their knees. By nightfall, the Bennett farm had almost disappeared beneath the storm. Rose Bennett stood barefoot in the narrow hallway outside the kitchen, her fingers curled around the edge of the wall, so tightly the wood pressed into her skin. Cold air slipped through the cracks in the house, carrying the smell of whiskey, wet wool, and smoke from the iron stove. Inside the kitchen, her father coughed hard into his sleeve before pouring another drink. Calvin Crow sat across from him at the table, broad shoulders filling the chair like he owned the room already. Snow melted from his black coat onto the floorboards. A leather ledger rested beside his hand. "You've had since October," Calvin said flatly. "Spring comes, I take the land." Earl Bennett rubbed both hands across his face. His eyes were red again tonight. Rose had learned to tell how bad the drinking was by the sound of his breathing. "You'll get your money," Earl muttered. "With what?" Calvin leaned back slowly. "Half your horses are gone. Corn failed. Roofs collapsing over the east barn." Silence followed, only the storm scratching at the windows. Rose lowered her eyes to the old suitcase sitting beside the hallway bench. Her mother's suitcase. The brass latch was broken. Earl had dragged it down from the attic earlier that evening without explaining why. A knock sounded at the front door. 3 slow knocks. Earl straightened immediately. "That'll be Turner." Rose heard boots crossing the porch. Cold wind burst through the house as the door opened. Snow swirled in with it. Wyatt Turner stepped inside carrying the smell of leather, horses, and winter air. Rose had seen him before in town, always quiet, always alone. Tonight snow clung to the shoulders of his long brown coat. His gloves looked stiff with ice. He removed his hat carefully near the door, revealing dark hair damp from melted snow. "Roads near buried past Miller Creek," he said. "Took longer than expected bringing the horses down." Calvin gave a short grunt. "You got paid already?" Wyatt nodded once. "Dropped the herd at Lawson's stable before sunset." Earl poured him coffee without asking. His hand shook while sliding the cup across the table. Rose noticed Wyatt glance around the room once, not curious, just observant. The kind of man who noticed broken things without pointing at them. Calvin opened the ledger. "You know Earl owes me $80. Wyatt stayed standing. "That's his business. It becomes yours when desperate men start making offers." Something changed in the room then. Rose felt it before anyone spoke. Earl swallowed hard. "I can settle it." "With what?" Calvin asked again. Earl stared into his whiskey for several long seconds. Then he lifted his head toward Wyatt. "Take the girl instead." Rose stopped breathing. The kitchen fell silent except for the crackle of firewood. Wyatt didn't move. For the first time since entering the house, he looked completely caught off guard. Calvin let out a low laugh through his nose. "Now there's an offer." Earl kept talking too quickly, like a man trying to outrun shame before it reached him. "She cooks, sews, knows horses better than most ranch hands. You take her up to your place a while. Debt's cleared." Rose pressed harder against the hallway wall. Her stomach twisted so sharply she thought she might collapse onto the floorboards. Wyatt's voice came rougher now. "She ain't cattle. No, Earl snapped suddenly, embarrassed by his own desperation. But she's all I got left worth trading. The words landed harder than the storm outside. Rose stared down at her bare feet, one loose floorboard beneath her toes, a water stain near the wall. Tiny things suddenly became easier to look at than the truth sitting inside that kitchen. Calvin reached for his drink. Girl's 19, young enough to start over somewhere. Wyatt's jaw tightened. Rose watched him through the narrow crack in the hallway, watched the way his eyes shifted once toward the darkness where she stood hidden. Not directly at her, just near enough to make her wonder if he knew she was there listening. I didn't come here for this, he said quietly. No, Calvin replied. But maybe you should. Another long silence stretched across the room. Then Earl spoke softer. You know what happens if Crow takes the farm. Wyatt looked tired suddenly, not angry, just tired in a deep way. Outside, wind slammed snow against the windows hard enough to rattle the glass. Finally, Wyatt set his coffee cup down untouched. If she comes with me, he said carefully, nobody touches her. Rose blinked. Calvin raised an eyebrow. Earl nodded too fast. Fine, fine. But Wyatt kept looking at him. I mean it. Something in his voice changed the room. Low, steady, final. Even Calvin Crow stopped smirking. Rose backed away from the hallway before anyone could see her face. She reached her room and shut the door quietly behind her before her knees gave out beneath her. The storm kept falling through the night. She didn't sleep, just sat beside the frozen window, watching snow bury the yard inch by inch, while voices drifted faintly below. Near dawn, the house finally went quiet. A few hours later, Earl Bennett shoved the old suitcase into her hands. You leave before the roads freeze worse. Rose looked at him for a long moment. He couldn't meet her eyes. Not once. Her coat still smelled faintly of cedar from last winter. She buttoned it slowly with numb fingers, while Earl waited near the door, already drunk again. Outside, Wyatt Turner stood beside a wagon dusted white with snow. Two draft horses shifted impatiently in the cold. He looked at Rose once, only once. There was apology in his eyes, and something else she couldn't place. Maybe shame, maybe restraint, maybe grief. Rose climbed into the wagon without speaking. Behind her, the Bennett house stood crooked beneath the storm clouds, smoke barely rising from the chimney. No goodbye came from the porch. No hand lifted. No voice called her back. Wyatt gathered the reins quietly. The wagon creaked forward into the white Wyoming morning. Rose pulled her coat tight around herself and stared at the road ahead, unable to shake the feeling that somewhere during the night she had stopped being a daughter and become something else entirely. Something traded, something handed away. Beside her, Wyatt Turner kept his eyes fixed on the snow-covered trail disappearing into the mountains. The wagon wheels groaned through packed snow while the wind pushed against them from the north. Rose sat stiff beneath the wool blanket folded across her lap. She hadn't spoken since leaving the Bennett farm. Neither had Wyatt. Now and then he clicked softly at the horses, or adjusted the reins with gloved hands roughened by winter work. That was all. By noon they passed Miller Creek, half frozen beneath gray sheets of ice. Smoke rose from distant cabins tucked against the hills. A pair of ranch boys rode past driving cattle south before the deeper storms came. One tipped his hat toward Wyatt. His eyes lingered on Rose. Wyatt shifted the wagon slightly, enough to place himself between her and the road. It was small, barely noticeable. Still, Rose noticed. Near sunset, the mountains rose taller around them, dark pine trees cutting through the snow like black scars. The trail narrowed sharply along a ridge where old wagon tracks disappeared beneath drifting white powder. That drop goes 30 feet down, Wyatt said quietly without looking at her. Best hold the side rail. It was the first thing he had said directly to her all day. Rose wrapped cold fingers around the wooden rail. The wagon tilted slightly over frozen ruts before leveling again. An hour later, she finally saw the ranch. It sat beneath a ridge of snow-covered pines at the edge of a wide-open valley, small, quiet. A barn leaning slightly east from old wind damage, thin smoke drifting from a stone chimney. Not much land, not much of anything, but nothing looked neglected. The fence posts stood straight despite the weather. Firewood had been stacked neatly beneath canvas beside the porch. A lantern already burned near the stable doors. Wyatt climbed down first. Snow crunched beneath his boots. "You can stay seated," he said. "Ground's slick." Rose ignored him and stepped down herself. Her boots hit packed snow harder than expected, and she nearly slipped before catching her balance. Wyatt moved instinctively, one hand lifting halfway toward her arm. Then he stopped himself. The gesture hung awkwardly between them before he lowered his hand again. The cold stung Rose's cheeks immediately. Wyatt carried her suitcase onto the porch while she followed slowly behind him. Inside, the house smelled like pine smoke, coffee grounds, and old leather. Warmth touched her face for the first time all day. The cabin only held 3 rooms: a small kitchen, a narrow bedroom, another smaller room near the back, with a crooked window facing the mountains. Wyatt set her suitcase beside the bed in the smaller room. "You can take this one," he said. Rose looked around carefully. The quilt had been folded neatly. Fresh water sat in a basin near the washstand. Someone had even placed a clean bar of soap beside it. Everything looked prepared days in advance. That unsettled her, more than if the room had been empty. Wyatt rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "Lock sticks sometimes in cold weather. I'll fix it before dark." Rose finally looked directly at him. "You knew my father would send me here." A flicker crossed his face. No, the answer came too quickly to be false. He held her gaze only a second before looking toward the floorboards instead. "I knew Earl was in trouble," he admitted. "Didn't know he'd." His jaw tightened briefly. "Didn't know that." Rose said nothing. Outside, wind rattled against the side of the cabin. Wyatt cleared his throat. "There's stew warming on the stove if you're hungry." "I'm not." He nodded once as if expecting that answer. After a moment, he walked back outside without another word. Rose waited until the door shut before sitting slowly on the edge of the bed. The mattress dipped beneath her weight with a soft creak. For several long minutes, she simply stared at her hands resting in her lap. 19 years old, and sitting in a stranger's cabin because her father couldn't pay a gambling debt. The thought hollowed her chest all over again. Darkness settled early in the mountains. Later that evening, Rose stepped quietly into the kitchen after washing. She had changed into her plain blue nightdress and braided her damp hair loosely over one shoulder. The cabin was silent. A bowl of stew still sat warming near the stove beside a fresh piece of cornbread, covered with cloth to keep heat in. Wyatt was nowhere inside. Rose moved toward the front window. At first, she only saw snow blowing through darkness. Then she noticed movement near the barn. Wyatt sat wrapped in an old coat beside the stable doors, hat pulled low against the wind. A lantern burned beside him while he repaired a broken harness strap beneath the falling snow. Rose frowned slightly. The barn loft light glowed faintly behind him. That was where he planned to sleep, outside, in weather cold enough to freeze water buckets solid overnight. The realization sat strangely in her chest. A little after midnight, she woke to hard wind battering the cabin walls. Snow hissed against the windows like sand. Then came hammering. Rose sat upright instantly. She pulled on her coat and stepped into the hallway, barefoot. Cold air slid beneath the doorframe. Wyatt stood outside on the porch roof edge, securing heavy canvas across loose shingles while snow whipped around him violently. The wind nearly knocked him sideways once. Still, he kept working. Rose pushed the front door open. "What are you doing?" Wyatt looked down sharply, surprised to see her awake. Roof corner came loose. Snow clung to his hair and shoulders. "You'll fall. Not if I finish fast." The wind hit harder again, rattling the whole cabin beneath them. Rose watched him secure the final rope before climbing down carefully onto the porch. His gloves were stiff with ice. For a second, neither moved. Then Wyatt stepped back from the doorway, keeping Snow outside. "Sorry if I woke you." Rose stared at him, standing there half frozen, while checking the roof in the middle of a blizzard so the cabin stayed warm. No complaint, no bitterness, just quiet certainty that it needed doing. "You should come inside," she said, before thinking. Wyatt hesitated. "I'm fine in the loft." "You're freezing. I've had worse." Rose looked past him toward the barn swallowed in darkness. Then back at the ice, gathered along his coat collar. For the first time since leaving Elk Ridge, something inside her uncertainty shifted slightly off balance. Very slightly, enough to notice. Wyatt lowered his eyes after a long moment. "Get some sleep, Rose." He walked back toward the barn, carrying the lantern into the storm while she stood in the doorway, watching snow gather across his shoulders. Long after he disappeared inside the stable, Rose remained there, listening to the wind move through the mountains. The cold no longer felt quite the same. Morning arrived pale and gray over Elk Ridge. Snow covered the valley in smooth, untouched layers that reflected weak winter light through the cabin windows. Rose woke to the smell of coffee. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then she heard boots crossing the porch outside and remembered everything. She dressed slowly in the thin morning chill and stepped into the kitchen. Wyatt stood at the stove with his back to her, pouring hot water through a cloth coffee strainer clipped above a tin pot. Steam curled around his shoulders. The floor creaked beneath her feet. Wyatt glanced over quickly. "Sorry. Didn't mean to wake you." "I was already up." He nodded once and handed her a chipped blue mug without meeting her eyes directly. The coffee smelled strong and bitter. Better than anything Earl Bennett ever kept in the house. Snowmelt dripped steadily outside the roof edge. "You know how to saddle?" Wyatt asked after a while. Rose looked up. "I grew up around horses." "Right." A faint flush crossed his face, almost embarrassed by the question. "Forgot that." Silence settled again. Not uncomfortable exactly, just careful. Later that morning, Wyatt showed her the small stable behind the cabin. 2 workhorses occupied the larger stalls. A restless bay mare stamped near the back wall, while snow blew through cracks in the barn boards. Rose reached toward the mare slowly. "She bites," Wyatt warned. The horse lowered its head into Rose's palm instead. Wyatt stared for half a second before looking away toward the tack shelf. "Huh." Rose almost smiled. Almost. The days settled into a quiet rhythm after that. They chopped firewood before sunset, hauled water from the half-frozen well behind the cabin, fed chickens before the wind grew too sharp at dusk. Wyatt rarely spoke unless necessary, but Rose began noticing things about him anyway. The way he checked every door twice before bed during storms. How he always left the warmest spot near the stove for her without mentioning it. The habit he had of wiping snow from his boots before entering the cabin, even when exhausted. One night, Rose woke thirsty and stepped quietly into the kitchen. Light still glowed beneath the stove. Wyatt sat at the table, repairing one of her boots. The torn leather rested carefully across his knee while he worked a needle through the sole with rough, steady fingers. Rose froze in the hallway. He hadn't noticed her yet. His coat still carried snow from outside. He must have come in only minutes earlier from the barn. Yet there he sat fixing something that belonged to her before tending to himself. Rose looked down at the boot she still wore. The stitching had started splitting near the heel 3 days ago. Without thinking, she stepped backward before the floor could creak. Back into her room. Back beneath the blankets. Her chest felt strangely tight afterward. The next afternoon, clouds rolled low across the mountains while Wyatt repaired fence posts near the ridge trail. Rose hung damp clothes beside the stove when she noticed an old photograph tucked near the shelf above the fireplace. A young woman smiled back from faded paper, dark curls pinned beneath a winter scarf, one gloved hand resting on Wyatt's arm. Rose stared quietly. Not beautiful in the polished way town women tried to be, but warm, alive, loved. The cabin door opened suddenly behind her. Wyatt stepped inside, carrying Snow on his shoulders. His eyes followed hers immediately toward the photograph. Everything in him went still. Rose lowered her hand at once. "I'm sorry, I wasn't snooping." Wyatt removed his gloves slowly. "You weren't." He crossed the room and lifted the photograph with careful fingers before setting it face down near the shelf. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, Rose asked softly, "Was she your wife?" A shadow crossed his face. "No." That single word carried enough weight to stop further questions. Rose nodded once. Outside, wind brushed softly against the cabin walls. That evening, the storm arrived harder than expected. Snow hammered the roof after midnight, while cold air pushed through every crack in the cabin. Rose woke again to strange noises outside. Not the horses, not the wind, footsteps. She wrapped herself in a blanket and moved toward the front window. Wyatt sat on the porch beneath the blowing snow, lantern beside him, watching the roofline carefully while gripping a length of rope in gloved hands. The temperature had dropped badly. Even through the glass, she could see frost gathering along his coat collar. Rose opened the door immediately. "You're out here again." Wyatt looked over his shoulder, roof beams shifting under the snow load. "You can watch it from inside. If it gives way, I need to catch it fast." Snow swirled across the porch between them. Rose stared at him sitting there alone in freezing darkness, protecting a cabin that barely belonged to him anymore. Protecting her. Something moved quietly inside her chest then. Not trust yet, but no longer fear. Wyatt rubbed warmth back into one stiff hand and glanced toward the mountains. "Go back inside, Rose. Wind's getting worse." Instead, she disappeared into the kitchen. A minute later, she returned, holding his untouched coffee mug, reheated over the stove. Wyatt blinked slightly as she handed it toward him. Their fingers brushed for the first time. Only briefly. Still, both of them paused. Rose pulled her hand back first. "You'll freeze out here," she murmured. Wyatt looked down at the steaming mug between his hands. Then up at her standing barefoot beneath the porch lantern with snow drifting around her shoulders. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to say something. Instead, he only nodded once. A quiet thank you without words. Rose returned inside slowly, while the storm rolled through the mountains around them. And sometime before dawn, listening to the wind fade little by little beyond the cabin walls, she realized she had stopped wondering whether Wyatt Turner was dangerous. Now she was beginning to wonder what had hurt him badly enough to make a man this gentle live like he deserved nothing at all. 3 days later, the roads finally opened enough for wagon travel again. The storm left the valley buried deep. Fence posts disappeared beneath drifts nearly waist-high, and every pine branch around the ranch sagged under frozen weight. Wyatt spent most mornings outside before sunrise, clearing paths between the stable, the well, and the chicken coop. Rose started rising with him. At first, Wyatt protested quietly. "You don't need to come out in weather like this." But she ignored him and pulled on her boots anyway. The work became easier with 2 people. One morning they carried water buckets together from the well, while weak sunlight spread across the snowfields. Wyatt walked ahead, breaking ice from the path with the flat end of an axe handle. Rose watched the steam of his breath drift through cold air. "You always work this hard?" she asked. Wyatt shrugged inside his heavy coat. "Winter don't care if you're tired." It sounded like something learned young. Later that afternoon, Wyatt saddled the bay mare and handed Rose the reins. "She'll behave better for you than me." Rose looked up sharply. "You trust me with her?" "You know horses." Simple answer, no hesitation. that unsettled her in a different way than cruelty ever had. People usually trusted her to clean. So, stay quiet, not with something valuable. The mountain trail behind the ranch curved along frozen hills dotted with cedar and pine. Snow cracked softly beneath the mare's hooves, while Wyatt rode ahead on an old gray gelding. For the first time since leaving Elk Ridge, Rose felt warmth touch her face that had nothing to do with fire. The valley stretched beautiful and lonely beneath winter light. At one narrow pass, the mare stumbled suddenly on hidden ice. Rose gasped as the horse slipped sideways near the ridge edge. Everything happened fast after that. Wyatt turned instantly. The mare panicked. Rose lost one stirrup. Then Wyatt was already there, grabbing the bridle hard with one hand, while catching Rose around the waist with the other before she could slide from the saddle. The horse settled after a few frantic seconds, but Wyatt didn't let go. His arm stayed wrapped around her longer than necessary, steady and warm through layers of wool and leather. Rose looked up. Their faces were close enough for her to see frost melting slowly in the dark stubble along his jaw. Wyatt seemed to realize the same thing at the exact moment she did. He stepped back immediately. "Sorry," he muttered, breath uneven now. "Didn't mean to." "It's all right." The words came softer than she intended. For a second, neither moved. Wind crossed the ridge between them, carrying the smell of pine and snow. Then Wyatt looked away first, like he always did. That night, Agnes Miller arrived near supper, carrying 2 jars of canned peaches wrapped carefully in cloth. The older woman swept into the cabin, trailing cold air and wood smoke, her cheeks pink from wind beneath a fur-lined bonnet. "Well," she said, eyeing Rose warmly, "at least this fool finally cleaned the place proper." Wyatt sighed under his breath while hanging her coat by the stove. Rose nearly smiled into her coffee. Agnes stayed through supper, talking enough for 3 people combined. Mostly stories about Elk Ridge winters, stubborn mules, and Wyatt as a boy. "He used to bring injured birds home in his pockets," she told Rose while buttering cornbread. "Near drove his poor mother crazy." Wyatt nearly choked on his coffee. "Agnes, what?" "It's true." Rose looked down quickly to hide her smile. It was strange hearing laughter inside the cabin. Stranger still realizing she liked the sound of it. Later, while Wyatt carried empty dishes to the wash basin, Agnes stepped quietly beside Rose near the stove. "You're wondering about the photograph," she murmured gently. Rose stiffened slightly. Agnes softened her voice further. Her name was Eleanor. Wyatt went still across the room, though his back remained turned. "Blizzard caught them crossing Miller Ridge 4 winters ago," Agnes continued quietly. "Wyatt made it out. She didn't." The room fell silent except for the crackling stove. Rose watched Wyatt lower his head slightly over the wash basin. Not dramatic, not broken, just tired in an old deep way. Agnes squeezed Rose's hand once before changing the subject completely, as if mercy itself required knowing when to stop speaking. After she left, the cabin felt quieter than before. Wyatt stood near the sink, drying 1 dish 3 times without noticing. Rose folded the dish towel carefully between her hands. "You loved her," she said softly. Wyatt stared down at the plate a long moment before answering. "Yeah, nothing more." But grief filled the single word enough to say the rest. Rose stepped closer without thinking, not touching him, just standing near enough that he wouldn't feel alone with the memory. Wyatt noticed after a moment. His shoulders eased slightly, though he still wouldn't meet her eyes. Outside, the wind brushed softly through the mountains again. Inside the little cabin, warm lamplight flickered across rough wooden walls, while 2 wounded people stood quietly beside each other in the kind of silence that no longer felt empty. And somewhere between the frozen mornings, the shared coffee, the careful distance, and the things neither of them knew how to say aloud, something gentle had begun growing there, something both of them were already afraid to lose. By late January, the snow around the ranch had hardened into thick gray banks along the fences. The worst storms had passed, but winter still sat heavy over Elk Ridge. Most mornings Rose woke before sunrise now. She would stir the stove back to life while Wyatt carried wood inside from the shed. Sometimes their shoulders brushed in the narrow kitchen. Sometimes they both stepped aside at once and apologized quietly at the same time. Those small moments stayed with her longer than they should have. One afternoon, Rose sat near the front window, mending Wyatt's work shirt, while weak sunlight slipped across the floorboards. Outside, Wyatt repaired a broken harness beside the stable fence. The peace of it almost frightened her, as if calm itself could not be trusted. Then she heard horses approaching. Not neighbors, too fast. Rose looked up immediately. A dark wagon rolled through the ranch gate, spraying dirty snow from its wheels. Two men sat up front beneath heavy coats. Calvin Crow stepped down first. The warmth inside the cabin disappeared all at once. Wyatt was already moving before Rose reached the door. He crossed the yard slowly, placing himself between the wagon and the cabin, without even thinking about it. Calvin brushed snow from his gloves. Turner, Wyatt's voice stayed flat. Crow. Rose stepped onto the porch quietly behind them. Calvin noticed her instantly. His eyes traveled over her, in the same cold measuring way they always had back at the Bennett farm. Like checking livestock before purchase, Rose folded her arms tighter around herself. Calvin pulled folded papers from inside his coat. Earl Bennett skipped town 3 nights ago. Rose felt her stomach drop. What? Left debts in Cheyenne too, from what I hear. Calvin unfolded the papers carefully. Everything owed now falls to nearest family. Wyatt's jaw tightened. She don't owe you a damn thing. Calvin ignored him and looked directly at Rose. $80. Plus interest. Snow drifted sideways through the yard between them. Rose could barely hear the wind over the pounding in her chest. I don't have that kind of money, she said quietly. No. Calvin smiled faintly. But maybe we can work out another arrangement. Wyatt took one step forward. The movement alone changed the air. Calvin noticed too. I got a place in town, he continued smoothly, though less confident now. Warm house, clean bed. You stay there a while. Debt disappears. Rose went cold. Wyatt's voice came low enough to cut through stone. You need to leave. Calvin laughed once. Or what? You gonna buy her freedom? Something dangerous flashed across Wyatt's face then. Not wild anger. Worse. Controlled anger. The kind that sat very still. She ain't for sale. Calvin folded the papers slowly. Funny thing is, everybody keeps saying that while trading her around. The words hit Rose harder than the winter wind. Wyatt moved before she could even react. Not violently, just fast enough to close the distance. You say another word like that, he said quietly. You won't leave this ranch standing upright. The yard fell silent. Even Calvin's men stopped smirking. Rose had never heard Wyatt raise his voice before. That frightened her less than how calm he sounded now. After a long, tense moment, Calvin stepped backward toward the wagon. End of winter, he muttered. I'll collect one way or another. He climbed back inside. The wagon disappeared down the frozen trail a minute later, wheels groaning against packed snow. Only then did Wyatt finally exhale. Rose stared at him from the porch. You knew, she whispered. Wyatt removed his gloves slowly without meeting her eyes. He mentioned Earl owed more than gambling money. But you didn't tell me. I didn't want you worrying before there was reason. There's reason now. He looked toward the mountains instead of her. That silence told her more than words. That evening, Wyatt barely touched supper. He sat at the table staring into cold coffee while shadows moved softly across the cabin walls. Rose watched him quietly from the stove. Finally, she asked, What are you thinking about? Wyatt rubbed tired hands across his face. The horses. Rose frowned slightly. What about them? Another silence. Then he answered too carefully. Could sell the herd down in Laramie come spring. Rose stared at him. The horses were everything here. Work, money, survival. This ranch needs them. You need freedom more. The words settled between them heavily. Rose realized then what he had already decided. He was going to sell nearly everything he owned to clear a debt that was never his. A debt attached to her. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. Wyatt. He shook his head once. I won't let him take you. Simple words. No grand promise, just truth. Rose lowered her eyes quickly, before he could see too much in them. Later that night, wind rattled softly against the cabin windows while Wyatt slept at the table, exhaustion finally overtaking him beside the dying fire. Rose stood in the doorway of her room watching him, one arm folded beneath his head, boots still on, coffee untouched beside him. The lamplight softened the hard, tired lines of his face. Slowly she crossed the room carrying the old quilt from her bed. She draped it carefully over his shoulders. Wyatt stirred slightly, but didn't wake. Rose's fingers lingered near the edge of the blanket for one dangerous second longer than necessary. Then she whispered something so quietly, even she barely heard it herself. You're the first person who ever stayed. Outside, snow drifted silently across the dark Wyoming valley, while inside the small mountain cabin, two lonely hearts moved closer together in ways neither of them fully understood yet. And somewhere beyond the frozen hills, trouble was already finding its way back toward them. Maybe that's why stories like this stay with us. Because deep down, most people know what it feels like to be tired of carrying life alone. To wonder if kindness still exists out there somewhere beyond the cold seasons, beyond the mistakes, beyond the things other people decided you were worth. Rose thought her life had ended the night her father handed her away like part of a debt. Wyatt believed love only led to grief if you held it too close. Yet somehow, in a quiet cabin buried beneath Wyoming snow, two broken people slowly became a place of rest for each other. Not through grand speeches, not through perfect lives, just through small things. A warm cup of coffee, a repaired boot, a lantern left burning in the dark so someone else would feel safe coming home. And maybe that's the kind of love most worth finding. The kind that stays gentle, even after life has been hard. If you've ever walked through a lonely season of your own, or if someone's quiet kindness once helped carry you through it, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. And if this old Western tale gave you a little peace tonight, there are more waiting just down the trail. More stories about healing, second chances, and the people who find each other when they least expect to.